The unexpected upgrade. Sergeant Avery Carter stepped off the tarmac at Boston Logan International Airport, the familiar clamor of jet engines and overhead announcements mixing with the rush of air as the plane's door swung open. The cold winter air hit her face, sharper than she expected after months of blistering heat in Iraq. She took a deep breath, letting the chilly air fill her lungs, a reminder that she was finally home. It had been a long 6 months. 6 months spent in the unforgiving desert heat, surrounded by sandstorms, military camo, and the ever-present weight of danger. 6 months away from her family, her friends, and everything that felt familiar. Now, standing at the gates of Boston Airport, the weight of all those months seemed to melt away in the face of the one thing she longed for above all else: home. Her mind wandered back to the mission. She'd seen things no one should ever have to witness, and she'd carried the weight of it all alone for far too long. The horrors of war, the faces of fallen soldiers, and the bond she'd forged with her fellow soldiers. Each memory came rushing back in a flood of emotions. Her heart tightened as she thought of the friends she'd lost. But there was one thing that kept her going, one thing that made the sacrifice worth it: the thought of seeing her family again. The thought of being able to hug her mom, her younger brother, and hold them close, to share stories and experiences that had only grown more vivid with time. As she passed through the terminal, she could feel the familiar tension in her shoulders begin to ease. The metal bridge that led to her gate seemed to offer a path not just to the plane, but to everything she'd been missing. She walked through the crowd of travelers, feeling like a stranger in a place that used to feel so much like home. The airport was bustling with activity, the soft hum of conversations, the shuffle of shoes on the tile, and the rush of passengers catching flights to places both far and near. There was a part of Avery that felt disoriented, as if she didn't quite belong here anymore, but the promise of home kept her moving forward. The flight attendant at the gate smiled warmly as Avery approached. "Welcome, ma'am. You must be Sergeant Carter." The woman's voice was smooth and pleasant, with the professionalism of someone who had seen their fair share of travelers, but there was a certain warmth in her tone that caught Avery off guard. She had expected more indifference. After all, a soldier wasn't often treated with the same reverence as a celebrity. "Yes, that's me," Avery replied, smiling faintly as she handed over her boarding pass. The flight attendant scanned it quickly, her eyes widening for a brief moment before returning to her calm demeanor. "Your seat is in first class, ma'am. Enjoy the flight." Avery blinked in surprise. First class. She quickly glanced down at her ticket to double-check the information, but it was correct. There was no mistake. She had been assigned a seat in first class. She stood frozen for a moment, trying to make sense of the situation. It had to be some sort of mistake, an oversight, or maybe even an upgrade. Avery had never flown first class before, and the idea of it felt almost foreign to her. A military surgeon used to cramped seats and minimal luxuries in the back of planes wasn't exactly the kind of person who found themselves lounging in the spacious, plush seats of a first-class cabin. Still, the opportunity was too rare to pass up. She tucked her backpack under her arm, her boots clicking on the polished tile as she made her way toward the boarding bridge. She couldn't help but marvel at the surroundings. Everything looked so polished, so pristine. The aisle of the plane stretched before her, lit softly by the overhead lights, leading her into the unknown world of first class. As she stepped onto the plane, she felt the familiar hum of the engines beneath her feet. The interior was much quieter than the noisy cabins she was used to, and the soft leather seats of first class beckoned to her. Avery had always thought that first class was just for the rich and the privileged, not someone like her. She hadn't exactly grown up with wealth or excess. Her family had been working class, with hard work and sacrifice woven into the very fabric of her upbringing. The idea of luxury felt out of place in her life, but she wasn't about to turn down an unexpected chance to experience it. The flight attendant was waiting for her at the entrance to the first-class cabin, a smile on her face. "Your seat is just ahead, Sergeant. Right here to your left." Avery nodded gratefully, her senses overwhelmed by the luxurious surroundings. As she stepped into the cabin, the plush seats almost seemed to envelop her, offering a level of comfort she had never experienced before. The seat was wide and cushioned, with a small table for her drink and a view out the window that promised a peaceful, undisturbed flight. The fabric of the seat felt soft against her fatigues, an unexpected contrast to the roughness of her uniform. She sank into the seat with a sigh, leaning back to adjust her posture. The quiet hum of the aircraft seemed almost comforting now, a far cry from the chaos and noise she had grown accustomed to over the past 6 months. She looked out the window, watching as the final passengers boarded, her mind drifting toward the thought of home once again. The families, the reunions, the long conversations and laughter that she'd missed so much. It was almost surreal, this feeling of peace, this sudden shift from the chaos of war to the calm of a first-class cabin. For a moment, she allowed herself to simply exist in that tranquility, letting the world outside fade away. But that peace wouldn't last long. As she adjusted in her seat, she felt a presence behind her, a sharp voice cutting through the air. "Excuse me, I believe you're in my seat." Avery blinked and turned her head, taken aback by the interruption. Standing in front of her was a well-dressed man in his mid-40s, dressed in a crisp suit that looked far more suited to a corporate boardroom than a commercial flight. He looked down at her, a disapproving frown on his face. His eyes didn't meet hers. Rather, they seemed to linger on her uniform with a certain disdain, the kind of look that she'd grown used to over the years, but never fully accepted. For a brief moment, Avery's heart skipped a beat. Had she made a mistake? She glanced at her boarding pass again, making sure she wasn't in the wrong seat. No, she was certain it was right, but the man's insistence was unwavering. "I'm sorry, sir," Avery said, her voice steady despite the tension creeping up her spine. "This is my seat." The man's gaze hardened. He stepped closer, his tone sharp. "I don't think you understand. That's my seat. I've been assigned that seat, and I expect you to move." Avery's fingers tightened around the armrests, her mind racing. She had been in difficult situations before, war zones, hostile environments, and high-pressure moments. But this was different. This was a test of patience, a test of how she would handle something as trivial as a seat on an airplane. And yet, in that moment, it felt as if the weight of her uniform, her sacrifice, and the long months of service were all on the line. She took a deep breath, forced a calm expression, and replied, "Sir, I'm sorry, but I've been assigned this seat. If you'll check your ticket, you'll see that you're mistaken." The man didn't move, his gaze still cold and unyielding. He took a slow step forward, his posture rigid, as if his entitlement could simply will the situation into submission. But Avery wasn't one to back down. Not in Iraq. And not now. This was a test, and she was determined not to let it break her. A moment of confrontation. The tension between them hung in the air, like the weight of an approaching storm. Sergeant Avery Carter's heart beat a little faster as the man standing before her in first class seemed to take in the details of her military uniform. She had worn it countless times, through dust storms, long nights on patrol, and after countless briefings and deployments. But here, in this pristine first-class cabin, in the comfort of an unexpected upgrade, it felt almost like a badge of distinction. Yet the man in front of her seemed to view it as something else entirely, a source of irritation. He didn't move an inch, and his eyes locked on hers with a deliberate coldness. His posture was stiff and unbending, as if he was accustomed to being listened to being respected, simply by the force of his presence. The air between them crackled with unspoken challenge. Avery's grip tightened on the armrests as she studied the man. There was no mistaking his sense of entitlement, no mistaking the unspoken message in the way he stood, tall, imposing, with the air of someone who believed that the world should bend to his will. Avery, however, had never been one to back down from a challenge. Whether it was the commanding officer giving her an impossible task or an insurgent firing on her position, She had faced far worse than an arrogant passenger on a flight. Yet something about this situation, something about the way this man had dismissed her so casually, set her teeth on edge. She forced herself to speak calmly, her voice low but steady. "Sir, I understand you might be mistaken, but I've been assigned this seat." She gestured to the seat next to hers, the plush leather and wide armrests that seemed a world apart from the cramped military transports she was used to. "If you check your ticket, I'm sure you'll see this is my seat." Avery's hand brushed over the seatbelt as she spoke, a gesture meant to emphasize the matter at hand. The man's lips tightened, and for a moment, he said nothing. Avery could see the wheels turning in his mind, weighing the situation, whether to argue further or to simply demand his way. The silence between them stretched on, the hum of the plane's engines growing louder in her ears as if urging a decision. Her fingers twitched at her side, a muscle memory from years of military training, ready to act if necessary. But there was something else in her gaze, something quiet and resolute. She wasn't going to be intimidated. Not by him. Not now. "Well, this isn't right," the man finally said, his voice dripping with condescension. "This is a first-class cabin, miss. Not some cheap seat you get on a budget airline." He paused, as if letting the words hang in the air. "I don't know how you got that seat, but I'll be damned if I'm going to sit in the back because of a mistake." Avery's pulse quickened. She had been called worse in her years of service. She had endured insults, threats, and taunts from enemies, from civilians, and even from within her own ranks. But the cold disdain in this man's voice felt like a challenge she wasn't going to let slide. There was something about the way he spoke to her, as if her uniform and the sacrifices she had made didn't mean a thing in this world. Something about the way he assumed his privilege overrode her right to the same courtesy and respect that anyone else would receive. It was the same kind of dismissal that she had seen before, where someone assumed their station in life gave them the right to disregard the struggles of others. Avery kept her expression neutral. "Sir," she said, her voice calm but firm, "this seat was assigned to me, and I'm not giving it up." The man's eyes narrowed, and his posture became even more rigid, like a soldier bracing for a fight. For a moment, Avery wondered if he was going to escalate the confrontation. She could already feel the gaze of the other passengers starting to shift, some pretending not to watch, others clearly intrigued by the scene unfolding in the front of the cabin. The flight attendant, who had been standing by the entrance to the cabin, finally took a step forward, sensing the rising tension. "Is everything all right here?" she asked, her voice soft but authoritative. The man snapped his gaze toward her, clearly annoyed at the interruption. "Yes, everything's fine," he replied, his tone dismissive. "I simply don't understand how a person like her," he gestured vaguely toward Avery, "can get a seat in first class." Avery's eyes flickered with surprise, but she quickly suppressed the urge to react. She had heard worse, had seen worse. She had been the target of prejudice and judgment from people who didn't understand what it meant to serve, to sacrifice, to fight for a cause greater than themselves. But here, in this sterile, polished environment, it stung more than it ever had before. The flight attendant, however, seemed to sense the subtle shift in the atmosphere. She looked at the man with a calm expression, the professional courtesy of someone who had dealt with entitled passengers before. "Sir," she said, her voice smooth but firm, "the seat has been assigned to Sergeant Carter. If you'd like, I can help you locate your seat." The man hesitated, a flicker of frustration passing over his face. His fingers twitched, as if he was about to argue further, but then he seemed to reconsider. Avery could see the internal battle, his pride warring against the fact that he didn't want to cause a scene, especially not with a flight attendant watching. The room seemed to grow quieter in that moment, the tension palpable. "Fine," the man muttered, clearly not pleased, but realizing that the battle wasn't worth it. "But this is ridiculous." Without another word, he turned and began walking toward the rear of the cabin, muttering under his breath. Avery watched him go, her mind racing with thoughts. Part of her felt triumphant, vindicated, even. She had stood her ground. But another part of her felt a strange emptiness, as if the whole incident was somehow symbolic of the larger issues she had faced during her years in service. The fight wasn't just about a seat on a plane. It was about respect. It was about the sacrifices she had made and how others, like this man, seemed to disregard those sacrifices as if they meant nothing. The flight attendant, still standing nearby, gave Avery a sympathetic look. "I'm sorry about that, Sergeant. Some people just don't understand." Avery nodded but said nothing in response. The man had walked away, but the sting of his words lingered in her chest. It wasn't the first time someone had underestimated her, and it wouldn't be the last. She had learned long ago that there were some battles worth fighting and others best left behind. She settled back into her seat, her mind drifting once again to her family. The reunion she was about to have, the warmth of home. But even as she thought of those things, the words of the man echoed in her mind. She had earned her place here, on this flight, in this seat, and in the world she lived in. No one had given her anything. She had fought for every inch of it. As the plane's engines roared to life, Avery's thoughts began to settle, the tension of the confrontation fading as the plane ascended into the clouds. She looked out the window once more, her thoughts turning to her future, to the next chapter of her life, a life that she was determined to live on her own terms. The struggle within. Avery stared out of the small window, watching as the city of Boston receded beneath her. The plane's engines hummed with steady power, and the sensation of ascent was almost meditative. The cabin's cool, controlled air wrapped around her like a blanket, offering a comfort she hadn't realized she needed. But even as the turbulence of the confrontation settled, her mind churned with thoughts. The man's words, his tone, his disdain, had struck a chord. It wasn't the first time she'd encountered someone who didn't understand the life she had chosen, the sacrifices that came with it. It wasn't even the first time someone had questioned her right to take up space in this world. But something about this encounter felt different. Maybe it was the setting, the juxtaposition of her military uniform with the luxury of first class. Maybe it was the idea that, after everything she had been through, the smallest and most basic acts of recognition could still feel so distant, so unreachable. She leaned back in her seat, her muscles sore from the tension she'd been carrying throughout the confrontation. She could feel the weight of it now, like the remnants of something unresolved, still clinging to her shoulders. She was a soldier, trained for combat, trained to withstand everything from brutal physical challenges to the psychological strain of war. And yet here she was, questioning something as simple as the right to sit in a seat. She had expected this flight to be her respite, a moment to breathe, to shut out the noise, and just focus on one thing: going home. She had imagined this reunion for months, even years, had pictured the moment she would step off that plane and into her mother's arms, her younger brother's wide grin waiting for her. She could already hear her mom's voice, teasing her about how long it had taken for her to get back, how many vacations she had taken at other people's expense. And she could already feel the relief of her brother's embrace, the bond they shared that had only deepened in her absence. But that moment, the one she had looked forward to, was now clouded by something she hadn't expected. The bitterness of judgment, the coldness in the man's eyes, the subtle but unmistakable reminder that there would always be people who viewed her as less than worthy, less than deserving of respect, of kindness, of the things others took for granted. Her fingers drummed absent-mindedly on the armrest as she tried to focus her thoughts. It was like a knot in her chest that she couldn't undo, an uncomfortable weight she couldn't shake. It wasn't that she expected everyone to salute her, to offer her a seat at the table. She didn't expect the world to recognize her sacrifice as anything more than just her duty. But this moment, this tiny slice of life, this fleeting interaction on a flight, had awakened something she didn't know was still there. Something raw and unprocessed, buried deep within her. It was as if the man's words had peeled back a layer of her armor, revealing a vulnerability she hadn't realized was still so fragile. Her thoughts shifted back to her time in Iraq, to the dusty roads and endless days spent under the blistering sun. She remembered the convoys, the long hours of nothing but sand and sky, a constant vigilance. The war had changed her in ways she couldn't quite put into words. It wasn't just the combat, the firefights, the missions that required her to push through physical and emotional exhaustion. It was the quiet moments too, the moments of solitude, of reflection, when she would catch herself wondering why she was there, why she kept going. But she did keep going. She did what was required of her, no matter how difficult it was, because there was always the belief that one day she would come back home, come back to people who loved her, to a life that was waiting for her. The thought of family had always been the one thing that kept her grounded during the darkest times. But now, sitting here in the silence of first class, that sense of grounding felt elusive. The man's arrogance, his dismissive attitude toward her presence, was like a reminder that she had to keep proving herself, even when she was exhausted from the effort. It wasn't enough just to serve. It wasn't enough to fight. She had to constantly prove her worth, even to people who had no idea what it meant to give up everything for something greater than themselves. Avery closed her eyes, trying to shut out the noise of her racing thoughts. She needed peace. She needed to remind herself of why she did what she did, why she chose this path, why she wore this uniform. She thought of her mother's voice, soft and reassuring, always reminding her to be proud of who she was, to know her worth even when others failed to see it. But in this moment, Avery struggled to hold on to that pride. It felt like it was slipping through her fingers, like a distant memory she could no longer reach. The sound of a soft cough drew her out of her thoughts. She opened her eyes to find the flight attendant standing near the aisle, a gentle smile on her face. "Is everything all right, Sergeant?" she asked, her voice warm and inviting, a sharp contrast to the cold encounter with the man earlier. Avery hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, I'm fine," she said, the lie slipping out of her mouth more easily than she would have liked. She was far from fine, but she didn't want to unload her thoughts on a flight attendant, no matter how kind she seemed. She had learned long ago that in her line of work, emotions were a luxury she couldn't afford. The mission always came first. The job came first, and when she was in combat, there was no room for weakness. But now, here in this seat, she realized she hadn't allowed herself the space to process everything she had been through. The months in Iraq had been long, and though she had moments of peace, she had mostly been caught in a whirlwind of duties, missions, and responsibilities. There had been no time to think about the emotional toll it had taken on her, no space to just sit with herself and process the complex feelings that arose from a life spent in service to something larger than herself. The flight attendant gave a slight nod, as if sensing Avery's unspoken need for space. She turned and walked toward the front of the cabin, leaving Avery alone with her thoughts once again. Avery's hand hovered over the small plastic tray in front of her. She didn't reach for the small cup of water, nor did she have an appetite for the snack they offered. Her stomach was knotted, a reflection of the swirling emotions that refused to settle. She was so used to putting on a mask, of being the strong, unwavering soldier who could face anything, anyone, and come out unscathed. But now, in this rare moment of calm, she realized how much that mask had weighed her down. And then, as if on cue, her thoughts turned to the people she was flying home to, the people who loved her, who had waited for her return. She thought of her mother's unwavering belief in her, even when the world seemed to doubt her. She thought of her brother, how proud he was of her, even though she sometimes felt like she didn't deserve it. These were the faces that grounded her, the voices that kept her from falling into the abyss of self-doubt. She thought of the reunion waiting for her, the one she had pictured so many times over the past 6 months. The thought of hugging her mother, hearing her brother's laughter, and feeling the weight of the homecoming she had dreamed of, it brought a soft smile to her face. That was what mattered. Not the words of a stranger on a plane, not the judgment of someone who didn't understand the price she had paid. Avery straightened up in her seat, taking a deep breath as she refocused her mind. It wasn't the man's opinion of her that defined her. It was the people who mattered most. Her family, her comrades, and most importantly, herself. She had earned this. She had fought for it. The plane continued its flight, rising higher into the sky, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Avery felt the weight in her chest begin to lift, if only for a moment. She wasn't just going home. She was returning to herself. The weight of unseen battles. The steady hum of the airplane's engines reverberated through the cabin, a constant reminder that, in the end, the journey would always continue. But for Sergeant Avery Carter, the journey ahead felt more than just the physical distance between Boston and her destination. It was a metaphor for something deeper, something she had been carrying for years, but had never fully understood until now. The seatbelt sign flickered off, and the flight attendant moved down the aisle, offering refreshments to passengers who were beginning to relax, eager for the last leg of their journey to pass quickly. Avery declined, her mind still clouded, her focus distant. The moment with the man had stirred something inside her, something old and unresolved. The realization lingered, heavy like the sandstorms of Iraq that had once threatened to swallow everything in their path. She had fought so many external battles over the years, against enemies, against doubt, against the harsh realities of life in the military. But the hardest battle, the one she had never been prepared for, was the one within herself. She had always believed that she could leave the emotional toll of war behind when she returned home. After all, that was what she had been trained to do. Soldiers didn't have the luxury of dwelling on their emotions. The job came first. The mission was everything. It was the mindset that had carried her through countless missions, each more harrowing than the last. But now, sitting in the plush comfort of a first-class seat, surrounded by the muted sounds of everyday life, Avery realized how little she had truly processed the experiences of the last few years. The things she had witnessed, the lives she had lost, the weight of responsibility, all of it had been buried deep within her, pushed down and ignored. She had grown so accustomed to being strong that she had forgotten what it felt like to be vulnerable, to feel raw. And now, for the first time in a long time, that vulnerability crept to the surface, catching her off guard. It wasn't the man's words that had hurt her, but what they symbolized, the disconnect between the world she had been a part of and the one she was returning to. For so long, she had lived in a world where the stakes were always high, where every moment counted, and where the consequences of failure could be deadly. In Iraq, Avery had fought not just for her country, but for the soldiers beside her, her comrades, her brothers and sisters in arms. They had shared the same fears, the same triumphs, the same losses. They had understood each other in a way that was almost unspoken, a bond forged through shared sacrifice. But here, in the calm, sterile atmosphere of the airplane, it was hard to reconcile the soldier she had been with the civilian life she was about to return to. There were no clear lines, no shared understanding. People in this world didn't understand what it meant to give everything for a cause bigger than yourself. They didn't know what it was like to face the fear of not knowing whether you'd make it home. And worse, they didn't understand what it was like to live with the weight of that fear, even after you had returned. Avery closed her eyes, letting the memories wash over her, the faces of the soldiers she had lost, the missions that had left her shaken but still standing. She thought of her best friend, Sergeant Lucas Riley, who had been by her side through thick and thin. He had been the one to crack jokes when the days seemed unbearable, the one who had dragged her through the darkest moments, always pushing her to keep moving forward. She remembered the last mission they had done together, a routine convoy escort that had gone terribly wrong. The explosion had come without warning, a sudden burst of sound and heat that knocked them off their feet. Avery had barely regained her senses before she was pulling Lucas from the wreckage, his blood staining her hands, her uniform. The weight of that loss had stayed with her ever since. She had lost comrades before, but this loss had been different. Lucas had been family in a way no one else could understand. But in the weeks that followed, there had been no time to grieve. There were new missions to plan, new dangers to face. She had buried her emotions, locking them away in a deep, dark place where they wouldn't interfere with her ability to do her job. She had learned to shut down, to compartmentalize. There was no room for mourning in a war zone. You did your job, and you kept going. And when the mission was over, you came home, only to find that there was no escape from the ghosts that trailed behind you. Avery took a deep breath, opening her eyes and letting the cool air of the cabin fill her lungs. She wasn't in Iraq anymore. She was on her way home. The mission had ended. And yet, the weight of what she had carried with her for so long still clung to her like a second skin. Her fingers flexed around the edge of the seatbelt buckle, as if trying to anchor herself to the present. The flight attendant, who had noticed Avery's pensive state, walked past again, this time offering a small nod of acknowledgement. Avery smiled faintly, grateful for the brief moment of recognition. But there was still something missing. She wasn't just a soldier. She was a woman, someone who had her own fears, her own struggles, her own heartache. And for the first time in a long time, she felt the weight of all those things bearing down on her. She thought about her family, the ones who had been waiting for her return. Her mother, who had always been the steady hand in her life, the person who had taught her the value of resilience. Avery had learned so much from her mother: how to keep going, how to fight for what you believed in, how to love fiercely despite the world's challenges. Her brother, too, had always been her anchor, the one who had believed in her even when she didn't believe in herself. He had been young when she left, but now, years later, he was a man in his own right. What kind of man would he be? What kind of relationship would they have now? Could she reconnect with him after so much time apart? Avery's heart tightened at the thought. She had always been close to her family, but the distance that had grown between them over the years felt insurmountable at times. How could she explain to them what it had been like? How could she put into words the sacrifices she had made, the things she had seen? She knew they would try to understand. They always did. But could they truly comprehend the weight of the things she had carried home with her? The man's rude dismissal from earlier still lingered in the back of her mind. She had stood her ground, yes, but the thought of his words, that subtle sneer, that implied judgment, had opened a door to an uncomfortable truth. She was different now. The person she had been before she enlisted in the army no longer existed. And though she was eager to go home, to find solace in the familiar, she wasn't sure how she would fit into that world anymore. The challenges she faced now weren't as clear-cut as the ones she had confronted on the battlefield. In Iraq, the enemy was visible, tangible, something she could focus her energy on. But the war within herself, the struggle to reconcile her past with her future, was a battle that would not be so easily won. As the plane began its descent into Boston, Avery closed her eyes again, her mind racing with all the uncertainties that lay ahead. But beneath the fear, beneath the doubt, there was one thing she knew for certain. She had made it through. She had survived the darkest days, the hardest battles, and now she was coming home. It wasn't going to be easy, she knew that. Re-entry, reintegration, these things weren't simple. But for the first time in what felt like forever, Avery allowed herself to hope. Hope that her family would be there to help her navigate this new chapter. Hope that she could heal. Hope that the woman she had become could find peace in the life she was building. The plane touched down with a soft thud, the wheels connecting with the tarmac, signaling the end of one journey and the beginning of another. Avery's heart raced as she unbuckled her seatbelt, her fingers trembling slightly. This was it. She was home. But even as she stood and gathered her belongings, there was a quiet, resilient strength in her step. The journey ahead would be hard, no doubt, but Avery Carter was a soldier. And soldiers never stop fighting. Not for the world, not for others, and not for themselves. The return to the familiar. The airport terminal was a flurry of movement, people rushing to baggage claim, families reuniting, the low hum of announcements echoing through the overhead speakers. Avery's eyes scanned the crowd, and for the first time since the flight had begun its descent, she allowed herself to exhale, her shoulders dropping slightly as the weight of the last few days began to lighten. She was home. The words felt strange in her mind, foreign in a way she hadn't anticipated. How could she be home when so much of her life had changed? As she stepped off the plane, she felt the cool air of Boston rush over her like a welcoming embrace. The chill was nothing compared to the heat of Iraq, but it was a reminder of how far she had come. The people around her seemed so normal, so at ease in their own little worlds, and for a moment, she felt like an outsider. She knew that wasn't fair. She wasn't the only one carrying a story of pain, sacrifice, and loss. But the way the world around her seemed to hum with a kind of ordinary peace felt almost surreal. Was it always like this? Had she missed it? Avery pulled her duffel bag over her shoulder, her eyes automatically searching for the faces she knew would be waiting for her. It didn't take long. Her mother stood near the front of the waiting area, her eyes scanning the crowd anxiously. When she saw Avery, her face broke into a smile that could light up the entire terminal. "Baby," her mom called out, waving frantically, her arms outstretched. "I can't believe you're finally home." Avery felt her heart squeeze in her chest as she moved toward her mother, the world around her fading into the background. There was something about seeing her mom, about feeling the warmth of her presence, that made the uncertainty of everything else melt away. She was home in this moment, with her mother in front of her. And that was enough. Her mom pulled her into a tight embrace, holding Avery as if she might disappear again. Avery felt the familiar scent of her mom's perfume, lavender and rosewater, filling her senses, and for the first time in months, she allowed herself to relax into the hug. She let the stress of the journey slip away, as though the love between them could heal the invisible wounds she had been carrying all this time. "I've missed you so much," her mom whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how to even put it into words. She pulled back slightly to look at Avery, her hands cupping her daughter's face, her eyes filled with that maternal concern that only a mother could have. "You look so different, so strong. But I know you've been through a lot, honey." Avery nodded, the lump in her throat growing thicker with each passing second. "I'm okay, Mom. Really. Just happy to be home." Her mother gave her a knowing look. "I know you are, but that doesn't mean everything's all right. It's been 6 months, Avery, and I'm not going to pretend like I haven't worried about you every single day." Avery felt a wave of guilt flood through her. She hadn't wanted her family to worry. She hadn't wanted them to know how deeply the deployment had affected her. They had already given so much, sacrificed so much, just by being part of her world. The thought of adding to their burden, of making them feel the weight of her pain, felt impossible. But her mother was right. It wasn't just about being okay. It was about the things she hadn't been able to say, the things she hadn't even allowed herself to feel. She didn't know where to begin, how to explain the gnawing emptiness that had taken hold of her during the months away. She didn't know how to put into words the constant, unshakable fear that had lived with her. Fear of not making it back, of losing the people who had become her family, of seeing things she couldn't unsee. How could she share any of that with her mother? How could she let her in when she herself didn't know how to deal with the pain? "Mom," Avery started, her voice trembling slightly. "There's something I need to tell you. About Iraq." Her mother squeezed her hand, sensing the weight of what Avery was about to say. "You don't have to say it all at once, honey," she said gently. "I'm here for you. Always have been, always will be." Avery looked down at the floor for a moment, gathering her thoughts, her breath steadying. She had wanted this moment to be different. She had wanted the reunion to be about the good things, the things that would heal her. Her mother's embrace, her brother's laughter, the quiet comfort of home. But deep down, she knew there would be no healing without confronting the past. No moving forward without acknowledging everything she had been through. And the first step had to come here, with her mother. "I've lost people, Mom," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "People I cared about. People who were with me every day. And now they're just Gone. Her chest tightened as the words slipped out, and for a moment, the floodgates threatened to open. But she didn't let them. Not yet. Her mother's face softened, her eyes filling with an understanding that went beyond words. She reached for Avery's hand, holding it tight. "I know," she said quietly. "I know, sweetheart. And it hurts me to know you've been carrying that alone. But you don't have to carry it alone anymore. You're home now, and we're going to work through it together. You're not alone in this. I promise." The words settled in Avery's chest like a balm, soothing the ache that had taken root in her heart. She was home, yes, but more importantly, she wasn't alone. Not anymore. The simple truth of that reality seemed so obvious and yet so profound. She had spent so much time thinking that she had to keep the darkness to herself, that the only way to be strong was to hold it all in. But maybe, just maybe, strength also came in letting others help carry the load. Just then, Avery's younger brother, Jake, appeared at her side. His face lit up with excitement as he pulled her into a hug, his arms wrapping around her like he hadn't seen her in years. "Sis, it's about time you came back," he teased, his voice filled with the kind of lightheartedness that was so natural for him. "I've been holding down the fort without you." Avery chuckled, the sound foreign on her lips after months of silence and solitude. "I'm sorry to make you carry the weight, little bro." Jake pulled back just enough to look her in the eye, his expression serious for a moment. "You don't have to apologize for anything. I know what you've been doing, and I'm proud of you. Always have been." His words were simple, but they hit her harder than she expected. Jake was young, and the idea of his pride in her made Avery's chest swell with emotion. She had always been the protector, the older sibling who tried to shield him from the world's harsh realities. But here he was, standing in front of her, as if he were the one who had been holding it all together. Avery couldn't help but smile through the rising lump in her throat. "Thanks, Jake," she whispered, pulling him into another hug. "I'm glad to be home." The airport, the crowd, the bustle of the world around them, all of it faded into the background. In this moment, there was nothing but her family, the love between them, and the quiet promise of a future that, for the first time in a long time, seemed full of possibility. She didn't know what the road ahead would look like, or how long it would take to heal the wounds that ran deeper than any physical scar. But she knew she wasn't alone. And that, she realized, was the most powerful thing of all. Her journey had only just begun. Healing in the silence. The first few weeks back home were a blur. Transition so seamless yet filled with unseen fractures that only Avery could feel. She had imagined that returning would be like flipping a switch, that she would step back into the life she had left behind with open arms, ready to embrace the simplicity of peace. But peace, it seemed, was something she had to relearn. Her mother had decorated the house with fresh flowers in every room, little touches that spoke of her unspoken relief. The scent of fresh-cut roses and lavender filled the air, a stark contrast to the dusty, sterile air she had endured for months. There was comfort in those small, familiar things, the way the kitchen smelled when her mom baked her favorite cookies, the sight of the old armchair by the fireplace where she and her mother used to sit for long talks, the sound of her brother's laughter in the next room as he teased their mom about her overprotective nature. Avery spent the first few days catching up with her family, sharing meals, and reliving old memories. But slowly the cracks began to show. She would find herself staring out of the kitchen window for long stretches, the weight of her thoughts pressing down on her like a heavy cloud. Her family didn't understand what she was going through, not because they didn't want to, but because they couldn't. And as much as Avery longed to reconnect with them, there were parts of her, parts she hadn't even realized existed, that felt like a chasm between them. She hadn't told them about the nightmares yet, or about the cold, unshakable feeling that followed her wherever she went, like a shadow she couldn't escape. When she tried to sleep, she would see the faces of the soldiers she had lost, their eyes accusing her, even in her dreams. The images of their final moments were seared into her mind, refusing to let her forget. She'd wake up in the middle of the night drenched in sweat, her heart pounding in her chest, the remnants of a battlefield still echoing in her mind. But she didn't talk about it. Not yet. During the day, she kept busy, pretending everything was fine. She went for walks around the neighborhood, though her eyes never quite left the ground. She met friends for coffee, always forcing a smile, always keeping the conversation light, never letting anyone ask too many questions. And at night, she sat in the dimly lit living room, watching TV with her family, but feeling more distant than she had ever felt. It wasn't that she didn't love them. It was that she didn't know how to love them the way she used to. Her world had changed so dramatically, and they were still living in the world she had left behind. One afternoon, as Avery sat on the back porch, watching the clouds drift lazily by, her brother, Jake, came outside and sat beside her. They didn't speak right away. Instead, Jake simply handed her a cold bottle of water, and the two of them sat in the quiet, the weight of the unspoken words hanging in the air between them. Avery had always been the strong one, the one who set the example. But now, it seemed as though Jake had grown into someone who saw right through her. Maybe it was the fact that he had been through his own struggles growing up, or maybe it was just that he had been waiting for the right moment to say what had been on his mind. But either way, Avery couldn't shake the feeling that he knew something was wrong. Finally, Jake broke the silence. "You don't have to pretend, you know," he said softly, his eyes trained on the horizon, not meeting hers. Avery's throat tightened. "I don't know what you mean." "You don't have to pretend everything's okay," he repeated. "I know it's not. And I know you've been hiding it. I'm not stupid, Avery." She turned her gaze toward him, startled by the directness in his voice. "I'm not hiding anything," she said defensively, but the words felt hollow. She wasn't fooling anyone, not even herself. Jake let out a soft sigh and leaned back in his chair. "I don't expect you to tell me everything. But if you ever want to talk about what happened over there, or about anything, really, I'm here, okay?" Avery swallowed hard. She hadn't expected this. She had thought she could handle it on her own, that the pain would slowly fade away as the days passed, that the life she was rebuilding would eventually swallow up the shadows of the past. But the shadows were still there, and they weren't going anywhere. And Jake, with his quiet understanding, had just given her a doorway she wasn't sure she was ready to walk through. "I'll be okay," Avery said, her voice cracking slightly. "I just need some time. You don't have to rush, sis," Jake interrupted gently. "You've been through a lot, more than anyone should have to go through. And I'm not asking you to fix it all overnight. Just don't shut me out. Don't shut us out. We're your family." Avery felt a knot twist in her chest as she looked at her brother, the one person who had always been her anchor, even when she didn't know it. She realized then that the silence she had been carrying wasn't just affecting her. It was affecting everyone. It was pushing them away, making her family feel as though they were standing on the outside, watching her slowly slip away into something they didn't understand. And the last thing she wanted was to lose the people who loved her most. "Thanks, Jake," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what to say, but thank you." He smiled, the same grin that had once made her roll her eyes when they were kids. "You don't have to say anything. Just know you don't have to do this alone." And for the first time in weeks, Avery allowed herself to lean into the possibility of healing. She wasn't there yet, not even close, but she could feel the weight on her chest begin to lighten, just a little. She could feel the distance between herself and her family narrowing, slowly, cautiously. There was no clear path forward, no easy solution to the things she had been through, but there was something in the way her brother had spoken to her, something that reminded her that healing wasn't a solitary act. It wasn't about being strong or pushing through it. It was about letting go of the burden, little by little, and allowing others to help carry it with her. As the days passed, Avery found herself opening up more, not just to Jake, but to her mother as well. She began to share more about her time in Iraq, the things she had witnessed, the emotions she had buried so deep. It wasn't easy. It never would be. But each conversation, each small piece of her past that she allowed herself to speak aloud, began to loosen the grip of the trauma she had been holding onto. One night, after dinner, when the house was quiet and the sound of her mother humming softly in the kitchen filled the air, Avery sat with her mom at the kitchen table. The clock ticked away the minutes, and she found herself staring at the patterns in the wood grain, lost in thought. Her mother set a cup of tea in front of her, and then sat down across from her. "How are you really doing, Avery?" she asked, her voice gentle, yet knowing. "I know you've been trying to push through, but I can tell it's been hard." Avery sighed, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup. "I don't know, Mom. Some days are better than others. Some days I feel like I'm finally home, like everything is normal again. And other days it feels like I'm still stuck in Iraq, still fighting battles I can't see." Her mother reached across the table, taking her hand in hers. "You don't have to have all the answers right now. Just take it one day at a time. And remember, you don't have to fight those battles alone." The words wrapped around her like a warm blanket. And in that moment, Avery realized that her mother, her family, were right. She didn't have to fight alone. She didn't have to heal by herself. Healing wasn't about forcing herself to be whole again. It was about accepting the pieces of her that had been broken and allowing the people she loved to help her put them back together. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was filled with the quiet understanding that healing took time, that it would take effort, that it wasn't linear. But in that silence, there was also hope. Hope that, with time, Avery would find her way back to herself, not as the soldier she had been, but as the woman she was becoming. It was a new kind of battle, one that would take patience and vulnerability. But for the first time in a long time, Avery believed she could face it. With her family by her side, she didn't have to carry the weight of the past alone. And that, she realized, was the first step toward truly coming home.